The door slammed against the wall so hard that the picture frames rattled, and one crashed to the floor, glass scattering across the polished tiles. Mira stumbled back, her hand flying to her stomach, as Callum's voice tore through the house. "Get out," he said. "Get out of my house, right now." Behind him stood his mother, her arms crossed, her face twisted with disgust, as though Mira were something spoiled that had been left too long in the sun. His father stood near the staircase, silent, refusing even to look at her. It was his silence that hurt the most. He had once called her his daughter. Now he could not meet her eyes. "Callum, please," Mira said, her voice shaking. "Let me explain. Let me just—" "Explain what?" he snapped. "Explain how you trapped me? How you knew exactly what you were doing when you let this happen?" "I didn't trap you," she whispered. "This child is yours too. You were there. You know that." His mother stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "An Omega without a family, without a name, without anything to offer this house. And now you expect us to believe you didn't plan this from the beginning?" Mira's hands trembled as she pressed them against her middle, as if she could shield the small life inside her from the venom in the room. She had known, from the very first day she met Callum's family, that they did not approve of her. She had told herself it did not matter, because he loved her, because he had promised her a future. But promises, she was learning, were easy to make, and easier to break, when the person making them had somewhere else to run. "I loved you," she said quietly. "I still do. This baby is ours." Callum's jaw tightened. For one moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like regret. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask his family had trained him to wear. "You have until sunrise," he said. "After that, if you're still here, I'll have you removed by force." The words landed like a blow. Mira felt the room tilt slightly, felt the familiar wave of dizziness that had been creeping over her more often these past weeks. She placed a hand against the wall to steady herself, refusing to let them see her fall. "Fine," she said. Her voice did not shake this time. "I'll go. But you will regret this, Callum. Not because I wish you harm, but because one day you will understand exactly what you threw away." She turned and walked toward the door, her back straight, though every step felt like walking through water. Behind her, she heard his mother mutter something about Omegas who thought they deserved better than they were given. She did not turn around. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Not here. Not in this house that had once felt like home, and now felt like a cage she had finally been allowed to leave. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, biting through the thin fabric of her dress. She had left in such a hurry that morning, certain she would be back before dinner, that she had not thought to bring a coat. Now the wind cut through her, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she walked down the long driveway, gravel crunching beneath her shoes. She did not know where she was going, she only knew she could not stay. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling fingers, hoping, foolishly, that it might be Callum, that he had come to his senses, that he was calling to apologize. Instead, it was a message from an old friend, someone she had not spoken to in months, asking how she had been. She did not answer. She did not have the strength to explain that her whole life had just collapsed in the span of 10 minutes. The scent of rejection clung to her now, she knew. It was something she could not hide, no matter how she tried. Any alpha who caught it would know instantly what had happened, would know she had been cast off, discarded, marked as unwanted. It made her an easy target, and the thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her chest. She needed to get somewhere safe, she needed to think. She walked for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than one. The streets grew emptier, the houses farther apart, until the paved road gave way to a dirt path lined with tall, shadowy trees. She had wandered, without meaning to, toward the edge of town, toward the old forest that most people avoided after dark. Stories about that place had circulated for years, abandoned buildings, strange lights, animals that did not behave the way animals should. She had always dismissed them as nonsense meant to frighten children. Now, exhausted and frightened herself, she found she no longer had the energy to be afraid of stories. The real world had already proven itself far crueler than anything found in old tales. Her feet ached. Her stomach cramped, tight and sudden, and she stopped walking, bracing herself against a tree trunk until the sensation passed. She was farther along in her pregnancy than anyone at Callum's house had realized, She had hidden it well, wearing looser clothes, avoiding certain movements that might give her away. She had wanted to tell him herself, in her own time, in her own words. She had wanted the moment to be gentle. Instead, it had been stolen from her, twisted into something ugly by his mother's suspicion and his father's cowardice. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Mira looked up, and for the first time she noticed how dark the clouds had grown, thick and heavy, promising rain within the hour. She had no shelter, no coat, no plan. Panic began to claw at the edges of her composure, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. Panic would not help her now. Only her own 2 feet, and whatever wits she had left, could carry her through this night. She continued walking, following the dirt path deeper into the trees, telling herself that somewhere ahead there would be a town, a farmhouse, anything with a roof and 4 walls. The wind picked up, rustling through the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out, its cry lonely and strange in the darkness. Memories of the evening replayed themselves over and over in her mind. The way Callum's mother had looked at her, as though she were nothing more than dirt tracked in on someone's shoes. The way his father had refused to speak, refused even to defend her, though he had known her for 2 years, though he had eaten dinner with her every Sunday, though he had once told her she made his son happier than he had ever seen him. And Callum himself, the boy she had loved since she was 17 years old, the boy who had promised her forever, under a sky just like this one, dark and heavy with the threat of rain. She should have known better. Omegas without strong families were always vulnerable to this kind of betrayal. She had grown up without parents, raised instead by a distant aunt who had made it clear, at every opportunity, that she was a burden rather than a joy. When Callum found her, when he had chosen her despite everything, she had believed, foolishly, that she had finally found somewhere she belonged. She understood now how wrong she had been. Belonging was not something given. It had to be built, brick by brick, and apparently she had built her entire foundation on sand. A soft cramp gripped her stomach again, sharper this time, and she paused, one hand pressed flat against her middle, waiting for it to pass. The baby moved beneath her palm, a small, fluttering motion that filled her with both comfort and terror. Comfort, because it was proof that despite everything, this small life was still there, still fighting alongside her. Terror, because she had no idea how she was going to protect it. Not tonight. Not with nowhere to go and no one to call. She kept walking. The path curved sharply to the left, following the edge of a shallow ravine, and Mira had to slow her pace, careful of loose stones beneath her feet. The moon, when it appeared briefly between the racing clouds, cast long shadows across the ground, turning ordinary shapes into strange, looming figures. She told herself it was only trees, only rocks, only the wind moving branches. She told herself there was nothing here to fear beyond the storm itself. Somewhere behind her, far in the distance, she thought she heard the low growl of a car engine, and her heart leapt into her throat. Had Callum sent someone after her? Had his family decided that simply casting her out was not punishment enough? She pressed herself into the shadow of a large oak tree, holding her breath, straining to listen. The sound faded. Perhaps it had only been a car passing on some distant road, nothing more. Still, her hands did not stop shaking for several minutes afterward. She thought of her aunt, long since passed, and wondered what the older woman would say if she could see her now, pregnant and alone in the middle of an old forest, fleeing from the very family she had once believed would save her from a life of loneliness. She thought her aunt would probably say she had told her so, that love was never enough on its own, that an Omega needed to build her own strength rather than lean entirely on someone else's. Mira had never wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe in something softer, something kinder. Tonight, walking alone beneath a darkening sky, she began to understand that kindness alone could not keep her warm. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sudden, striking her bare arms and soaking into the thin fabric of her dress within moments. She quickened her pace, casting her eyes around for any sign of shelter, any structure that might offer even the smallest protection from the storm that was now breaking in earnest overhead. Thunder cracked, closer this time, and lightning briefly illuminated the entire forest in a flash of white light. In that flash, she saw it, a shape, angular and solid, rising up from the trees perhaps a quarter mile ahead. a building, a house, or what remained of one. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in her chest. She began to run, as best she could with her rounded stomach and aching legs, her shoes slipping on the muddy path, rain now falling in earnest, plastering her hair to her face and neck. She did not know who owned the house, or whether anyone lived there at all. She did not care. She needed shelter, and she needed it now, before the storm swallowed her whole, before her body gave out from exhaustion and fear and the terrible weight of everything she had lost in the span of a single evening. Thunder rolled again, louder, closer, and somewhere behind it, faint but unmistakable, she thought she heard something else. A sound so strange, so out of place in this abandoned stretch of forest, that she nearly stopped running to make sure she had not imagined it. But there was no time to wonder. The rain was falling harder now, and the house, dark and silent, was the only shelter for miles. She pushed forward, one hand cradling her stomach, the other outstretched before her, reaching for whatever safety those crumbling walls might offer, praying with every step that she would make it there before the storm, or her own body, betrayed her completely. The house loomed larger with every step, its outline sharpening against the flashes of lightning, windows dark and empty like blind eyes staring out into the storm. She did not know, could not have known, that stepping onto that porch would change everything, that behind those broken walls waited something far stranger, and far more important, than shelter from the rain. The porch steps groaned beneath her weight as Mira climbed them, rain streaming down her face, her hands trembling so badly she could barely grip the railing. The door hung slightly open, swollen with age and weather, and she pushed against it, half expecting it to refuse to move at all. Instead, it swung inward with a low, tired creak, revealing a wide hallway swallowed in darkness. She hesitated on the threshold, lightning flashing behind her, illuminating the interior for one brief second. Dust, cobwebs strung between old furniture, a staircase leading upward into shadow. Nothing that suggested danger, only neglect, only years of abandonment settled thick over every surface. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, cutting off the worst of the wind and rain, though the cold remained, seeping through the walls and into her bones. For a long moment she simply stood there, dripping onto the wooden floor, catching her breath, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. A sitting room to her left, furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts frozen mid-motion. A hallway stretching ahead, doors closed on either side. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and beneath that, faintly, something else, something that did not quite belong in a house no one had lived in for years. She told herself it was her imagination. Exhaustion did strange things to the mind, and she had not eaten since morning, had not slept properly in days, worried as she had been about how and when to tell Callum about the baby. Her body was running on fear alone now, and fear was not known for its honesty. She moved further into the house, careful of her footing in the darkness, one hand trailing along the wall to keep her balance. The sitting room offered an old couch, its cushions gray with dust, but dry, and for a moment, she considered simply collapsing onto it and waiting out the storm right there. But something pulled her forward, some instinct she could not quite name, urging her deeper into the house rather than settling near the door. Perhaps it was simply the cold. The sitting room, with its broken window at the far end, offered little protection from the wind that still howled outside. She needed somewhere more enclosed, more sheltered, if she hoped to stay warm enough to make it through the night. She continued down the hallway, testing each door as she passed. Most were locked, or stuck fast with age. One opened into what had once been a kitchen, cabinets hanging open, a rusted stove standing silent in the corner. Nothing useful there, at least not in the darkness, with no way to see clearly what remained. At the end of the hallway, a narrow staircase led both upward and, curiously, downward, toward what she assumed was a cellar. She had no interest in exploring further tonight. Her legs ached, her stomach cramped intermittently, and every instinct told her to find the nearest safe corner and simply rest until morning brought better light and clearer thinking. She chose a small room near the base of the stairs, its door slightly ajar, revealing what appeared to have once been a study. A heavy desk sat against one wall, and though the window here was also broken, someone, long ago she assumed, had nailed a board over most of the gap, leaving only a narrow strip open to the elements. It would have to do. She could not search this house forever in the dark, not in her condition, not with the storm still raging outside. She found an old blanket folded over the back of a chair, thick with dust but otherwise intact, and shook it out as best she could before wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled musty, of age and neglect, but it was dry, and warmth was warmth, regardless of its source. She lowered herself carefully onto the floor, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up as much as her rounded stomach would allow, and closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound the old house made, every creak of settling wood, every gust of wind rattling a loose shutter somewhere above, sent a fresh jolt of alertness through her exhausted body. She thought of Callum, of his mother's cold eyes, of the life she had imagined for herself only weeks ago, filled with nursery furniture and soft blankets, and a partner who would hold her hand through every step of what was coming. That life felt impossibly distant now, a dream belonging to someone else entirely. She thought, too, of the child growing inside her, and made herself a quiet promise in the darkness. Whatever happened next, whatever this house held, whatever the coming days demanded of her, she would protect this baby. She had no family to rely on, no partner to lean against, but she had herself, and she would have to be enough. Eventually, despite the discomfort and the fear, exhaustion won out. Her breathing slowed, her body sagged against the wall, and she drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, the old blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, the storm still murmuring faintly beyond the boarded window. She did not know how long she slept. It could have been an hour, or only minutes. What woke her was not the thunder, which had faded into a distant rumble somewhere far off, nor the rain, which had softened into a gentle patter against the roof. What woke her was a sound entirely out of place, in an abandoned house, deep in an forgotten forest. A baby, crying. Mira's eyes snapped open, her heart slamming against her ribs. For a moment she thought she had imagined it, some strange echo of her own thoughts bleeding into her exhausted dreams. But the sound came again, thin and distant, muffled by walls and distance but unmistakably real. A baby, somewhere in this house, curing, with the particular, piercing distress that only an infant could produce. She sat frozen against the wall, straining to listen, half convinced that if she moved, if she made a single sound, the noise would vanish and prove itself nothing more than a trick of her tired mind. But it continued, rising and falling, growing neither louder nor softer, simply persisting somewhere deep within the structure around her. Her first instinct was fear. This house was supposed to be empty. She had seen no other signs of life, no lights, no footprints in the dust, nothing to suggest that anyone else occupied these crumbling rooms. If there was a baby here, then someone else was here too, and she had no way of knowing whether that someone would welcome an uninvited stranger, sheltering from the storm. Her second instinct, stronger than the first, was concern. A baby crying like that, in the middle of the night, in a house that seemed otherwise abandoned. Something about it struck her as deeply wrong. Where were the parents? Why had no one come to soothe the child? The cries continued, unanswered, and something in Mira's chest tightened painfully at the thought of an infant left alone and distressed. She pushed herself carefully to her feet, using the wall for support, her body stiff and aching from the awkward position she had slept in. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and she left it where it fell, moving instead toward the door of the small study, straining to determine which direction the crying originated from. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the house, past the kitchen, perhaps from a room she had not yet explored. She hesitated at the threshold, torn between the instinct for self-preservation that told her to stay hidden, to wait quietly until dawn, and then simply leave without drawing attention to herself, and the instinct that told her no child's cries should go unanswered, regardless of the risk to herself. The cries rose in pitch, more insistent now, and that decided it for her. Whatever waited deeper in this house, whoever might be lurking in these shadowed rooms, she could not simply stand by while an infant cried out in distress. She had spent her entire life being told that she did not matter enough to protect, that her needs came second to everyone else's convenience. She would not become someone who ignored a child's suffering simply because it was inconvenient, or frightening, or dangerous. She stepped out into the hallway, moving as quietly as her tired body allowed, one hand trailing along the wall for balance, The other pressed protectively against her own stomach. The darkness pressed in around her, broken only by faint slivers of moonlight, where the clouds had begun to part outside. The crying continued, guiding her forward, like a thread pulling her deeper into the unknown. She passed the kitchen, its rusted stove barely visible in the gloom, and continued toward a part of the house she had not yet ventured into during her earlier exploration. A door stood at the end of this new hallway, slightly ajar, warm light flickering faintly from within, the first sign of light she had seen anywhere in the house since her arrival. Her breath caught. Someone was in there. Someone with a candle, or a lamp, or some other source of light, which meant someone was very much alive in this supposedly abandoned house. The crying grew louder as she approached, and beneath it now she thought she heard something else, a low voice, tired and strained, murmuring words she could not quite make out, the voice of someone trying, and failing, to soothe the distressed child. Mira paused, just outside the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the walls. Every rational instinct told her to turn back, to return to her hiding spot in the study, and wait for morning. But the baby's cries, raw and desperate, held her in place, and slowly, carefully, she reached out and pushed the door open just wide enough to see inside. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs entirely. The room beyond the door was small, but clearly lived in, unlike every other space she had passed through in this house. A single lamp, its light low and flickering, sat on a wooden table beside a narrow bed. Blankets, actual clean blankets, not the dust-covered relics she had found elsewhere, were folded neatly in a basket near the wall. And in the center of the room, pacing slowly back and forth with a small bundle cradled against his chest, stood a man Mira had never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair unkempt as though he had not thought about his appearance in some time. He wore a plain shirt, sleeves pushed up past his forearms, and his face, when he turned slightly toward the lamplight, looked exhausted in a way that went far beyond a single sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His jaw was tight with the particular strain of someone who had been holding himself together through sheer will, for far longer than was healthy. The baby in his arms continued to cry, its small face red and scrunched with distress, and the man murmured to it in a low, rough voice, words Mira still could not quite make out, though the desperation in his tone needed no translation. He rocked the child gently, adjusting his hold, trying one position and then another, clearly running out of ideas. Mira stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to announce herself or retreat before she was noticed. Before she could decide, the man's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid as his eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. The baby's cries filled the silence between them, and Mira watched a dozen emotions flash across the stranger's face in rapid succession. Shock first, then something sharper, more dangerous, an instinctive wariness that made every muscle in his body tense as though preparing for a threat. "Who are you?" His voice was low, rough with exhaustion, but there was an edge to it that made Mira's pulse quicken. "How did you get in here?" "I'm sorry," she said quickly, raising both hands slightly, palms open, an instinctive gesture of harmlessness. "I didn't mean to intrude. There was a storm, and I saw the house, and I thought it was empty. I just needed shelter." His eyes narrowed, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see straight through her explanation, to whatever truth lay beneath it. His gaze dropped briefly to her stomach, then back to her face, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not quite read what. "This house isn't on any map," he said. "No one finds it by accident." "I wasn't looking for it," Mira said. "I was walking. I didn't have anywhere else to go, and then it started raining, and I saw the outline of the house through the trees. I swear, I only wanted somewhere dry to wait out the storm." The baby's cries had softened slightly, as though sensing the shift in tension in the room, though it still fussed and squirmed in the man's arms. He looked down at the child, his expression softening for just a moment, before hardening again, as he looked back at Mira. "You need to leave," he said. "Now. Before." "Please," Mira interrupted, surprising herself with the force in her own voice. "I heard him crying. I know it's not my business. I know I shouldn't be here. But I couldn't just ignore it. Is he all right? Is something wrong with him?" The man's jaw tightened further, and for a moment, she thought he would simply repeat his demand that she leave. Instead, something in his shoulders sagged, just slightly, the posture of a man who had been fighting alone for too long and had, for one brief moment, run out of strength to keep pretending otherwise. "He won't stop crying," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him something to say aloud. "He's been like this for hours. I've tried everything. Feeding him, changing him, walking with him. Nothing works." Mira hesitated only a moment before stepping fully into the room, her earlier fear giving way to something more urgent. She had spent years helping care for the younger children in her aunt's neighborhood, back when she was still young enough herself to be given such responsibilities freely. She recognized certain signs in the way the baby held his small body, the particular quality of his cries. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hands. "I've cared for babies before. Sometimes it helps to have someone else try, even just for a few minutes." The man's eyes flicked between her face and the child in his arms, clearly torn between suspicion and the desperate exhaustion of a parent who had been fighting this battle alone for far too long. Finally, reluctantly, he stepped forward and placed the baby carefully into her waiting arms. The moment the child settled against her, Mira noticed several things at once. His small body felt warmer than it should, his skin slightly flushed, and his cries, when she listened closely, carried a particular rasping quality that suggested more than simple fussiness. "Has he been eating well?" she asked, gently shifting the baby's position, supporting his head as she rocked him in a slow, steady rhythm. "And has he had a fever recently?" The man's expression shifted again, surprise flickering across his tired features. "He's been eating less the past 2 days, and yes, he's felt warm, but I didn't have anything to check with. I didn't think—" He stopped himself, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I don't know what I'm doing. I've never done this before." "You're doing better than you think," Mira said quietly, continuing her gentle rocking. The baby's cries, remarkably, began to soften, his small fists unclenching slightly as he settled against her. "But I think he might be sick. Not seriously, not from what I can tell right now, but he needs proper care. Do you have anything for a fever, anything cool to bring his temperature down?" The man shook his head slowly, and Mira saw, with a small jolt of understanding, just how isolated this house truly was, how little this man had prepared for the reality of caring for an infant entirely alone. "There's a well outside," he said. "I can get cool water. I don't have medicine. I haven't left the property in weeks." Mira looked down at the baby in her arms, his cries now reduced to soft, exhausted whimpers, his small face still flushed with fever. Something in her chest tightened, an ache that had nothing to do with her own circumstances, and everything to do with the vulnerability of this small, struggling life. "Get the water," she said, "and a cloth, if you have one. We can bring the fever down gently, while we figure out what else he needs." The man hesitated only a second longer before nodding and disappearing from the room, his footsteps quick and purposeful down the hallway. Mira remained where she was, swaying gently with the baby cradled against her chest, murmuring soft, wordless sounds of comfort, the way she remembered doing years ago, with the children in her aunt's neighborhood. The baby's eyes, when they finally opened, were dark and unfocused, gazing up at her without recognition, without any understanding of who she was, or why she had suddenly appeared in his small, isolated world. Mira felt something shift inside her, some instinct as old as time itself, responding to the vulnerability in that small face. "It's all right," she whispered, more to herself than to the child. "You're going to be all right." She heard the man's footsteps returning down the hallway, faster now, and a moment later he reappeared in the doorway, a bowl of water in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. His eyes went immediately to the baby, checking, she realized, to make sure nothing had gotten worse in the brief moments he had been gone. "Here," he said, setting the bowl down on the small table beside the lamp. "Tell me what to do." Mira guided him through the process, showing him how to dampen the cloth and gently wipe it across the baby's forehead, neck, and the soft skin behind his knees, explaining in a low, steady voice how the cool water would help draw the fever down, without shocking his small body. The man followed her instructions with a focus so intense it bordered on desperate, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. Slowly, gradually, the baby's cries faded entirely, replaced by soft, hiccuping breaths, as exhaustion finally overtook him. His small body relaxed against Mira's chest, his breathing evening out into the steady rhythm of sleep. The man straightened, watching the sleeping child with an expression of such raw relief that Mira felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for him, despite everything strange about their situation, despite the wariness that still lingered between them. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed determined not to name. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." He stopped, shaking his head slightly, as though the thought itself was too heavy to finish. "What's his name?" Mira asked softly, looking down at the sleeping infant in her arms. The man was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes fixed on his son's peaceful face. "Ellis," he said finally. "His name is Ellis." Mira looked up, meeting his eyes properly for the first time since she had stumbled into this hidden room, this hidden life. "I'm Mira," she said. "I really am sorry for intruding like this. I'll leave in the morning, as soon as the storm clears." Something complicated passed behind the man's eyes, a war of instincts she could not quite decipher. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "The storm isn't the only reason you shouldn't be walking through these woods alone," he said. "Not in your condition, not this far from anywhere." He hesitated, then added, almost reluctantly, "My name is Cade, and I think, for tonight at least, you'd better stay." Morning arrived slowly, gray light seeping through the boarded windows of the house, and Mira woke to find herself curled on the narrow bed in the small room, Ellis sleeping soundly in a makeshift crib nearby. She did not remember falling asleep. She only remembered the exhaustion finally claiming her sometime after the fever had broken, after Cade had insisted she rest while he kept watch over his son through the remaining hours of the night. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore, and looked around the room properly for the first time in daylight. It was small but carefully arranged, everything within easy reach of the bed: bottles, cloths, a small stack of children's clothing that looked handmade rather than store-bought. Whoever this man was, whatever strange circumstances had led him to raise an infant alone in an abandoned house deep in the forest, he had clearly been trying his best with what little he had. She found him in the kitchen, the same room she had passed through in darkness the night before, now looking entirely different in the pale morning light. He stood at the counter, a pot of something simmering on a small portable stove, his back to her, shoulders tense, even in this quiet moment. "You're awake," he said without turning around, though she had made no sound entering the room. "There's food, if you're hungry. It's not much, but it's warm." Mira hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of how strange this all was, how quickly she had gone from fleeing through a storm to standing in the kitchen of a stranger's hidden home. "Thank you," she said carefully, "for letting me stay last night, and for trusting me with Ellis." Cade turned then, and in the daylight she could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps only a few years older than herself, though the weight of exhaustion and worry had aged his face beyond his years. His eyes, dark and guarded, studied her for a long moment before he spoke again. "I didn't have much choice," he said. "You knew what to do. I didn't." "Where is his mother?" The question left Mira's lips before she could stop herself, and she immediately regretted the bluntness of it, watching Cade's expression close off entirely. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat, final, the tone of someone who had learned to shut a door firmly on a subject, rather than risk it being pried open. "It's just us now." Mira did not press further, though a dozen questions crowded her mind. She recognized, in the careful way he avoided her eyes, in the rigid set of his shoulders, the particular kind of grief that did not welcome company, that had learned to survive by staying silent, rather than risking the vulnerability of being understood. She knew that kind of grief herself, though hers wore a different shape. "I should go soon," she said instead, moving to sit at the small table near the window. "I don't want to intrude any longer than I already have." Something flickered across Cade's face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. He turned back to the pot on the stove, stirring it with more attention than the task probably required. "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air between them, simple but impossible to answer. Mira looked down at her hands, folded on the table in front of her, and found she had no honest response to give. She had no family to return to, no home waiting for her, no plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and the life that had rejected her so thoroughly the night before. "I don't know." she admitted finally. The words quiet, but honest. I don't have anywhere to go. Cade was silent for a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen the soft bubbling of whatever simmered on the stove. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a careful, measured quality, as though he were choosing his words with great deliberation. You're pregnant, he said. It was not a question. Mira's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a protective gesture she had performed so many times in the past day that it had become almost unconscious. Yes, she said simply. And whoever the father is, he's not with you. Again, not a question, but an observation, delivered without judgment, simply a statement of fact laid bare between them. He rejected me, Mira said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. How little it hurt to say them aloud to this stranger, compared to how much it had hurt to live them the night before. His family decided I wasn't good enough. I was cast out before I even had the chance to explain. Cade turned to look at her then, something in his expression shifting, softening slightly around the edges. That's why you were wandering alone in the storm. Yes. He was quiet again, considering something, his eyes moving briefly toward the hallway that led back to the small room where his son still slept. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, careful and deliberate in a new way. This house isn't much, he said. It's isolated, and it's falling apart in more places than I can keep up with repairing, but it's dry, and it's safe, and no one comes looking for anyone out here. He paused, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she had entered the kitchen. Ellis needs someone who knows how to care for a child properly. I've been managing, but barely, and last night proved that clearly enough. If you're willing to help with him, you can stay here, for as long as you need. Mira stared at him, uncertain she had heard him correctly.
You don't know anything about me, she said. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous.
A ghost of something almost like humor crossed Cade's face, quickly suppressed. You spent half the night bringing down my son's fever, instead of using the opportunity to search this house for anything worth stealing, he said. I think I can take the risk. And you? Mira asked carefully. I don't know anything about you either. Why are you out here alone? Why does this house look abandoned from the outside if you're living in it? Cade's expression tightened, and for a moment, Mira thought he would refuse to answer, would retreat back into the guarded silence that seemed to be his default state. Instead, he set down the spoon he had been using and leaned back against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. People talk, he said. When an alpha loses his mate, the way I lost mine, they don't offer sympathy. They offer curiosity, and pity, and whispers behind closed doors. I couldn't stand it. So I left, and I let this place look abandoned, because the alternative was strangers showing up at my door asking questions I have no interest in answering. Mira absorbed this quietly, understanding, in a way she suspected few others could, exactly what it meant to want to disappear from a world that had shown you its cruelest face. I'm sorry, she said softly. About your mate. Cade's jaw tightened, and he nodded once, sharply, a clear signal that the subject was closed for now. The offer stands, he said instead. Help with Ellis, and you'll have a roof and food for as long as you need it. No questions asked, beyond what you've already chosen to share. Mira looked toward the hallway, thinking of the small, fevered child she had held through the night, thinking of her own child growing within her, due to arrive in a matter of months with no home prepared, no family waiting, nothing but her own determination to see them both through safely. The offer, strange and unexpected as it was, represented something she had not truly believed she would find again so soon after losing everything else. All right, she said finally. I'll stay, and I'll help however I can. Something in Cade's shoulders loosened, a tension she had not fully registered until it eased. He nodded, turning back to the stove, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling into something that felt, if not entirely comfortable, at least no longer hostile. There's a room upstairs, he said eventually. It needs cleaning, but the roof doesn't leak, and the bed is sound. You're welcome to it. Thank you, Mira said again, and this time the words carried a weight of genuine gratitude that surprised even herself. She had arrived at this house the night before with nothing, fleeing a life that had discarded her without a second thought. She had not expected, in the span of a single night, to find herself standing in a stranger's kitchen. being offered shelter and purpose in the same breath. From down the hallway, a soft cry sounded, Ellis waking from his sleep, and both Mira and Cade turned toward the sound instinctively. Cade moved first, setting down the spoon and heading toward the hallway, but he paused at the doorway, glancing back at her. "Would you?" he started, then stopped, clearly unaccustomed to asking for help, the words seeming to cost him something significant to voice aloud. "I'll come," Mira said simply, rising from the table and following him toward the sound of the crying child, toward whatever strange new chapter of her life had just quietly begun, in this hidden, half-forgotten house, buried deep within the trees. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Mira nor Cade had expected, though both seemed grateful for the structure it provided. Mira woke early each morning, before the sun had fully cleared the treetops, and made her way down to the small nursery room to check on Ellis before Cade even stirred. The baby's fever had broken fully within 2 days of her arrival, and with proper feeding and consistent care, he had begun to thrive in ways that visibly eased the constant worry etched into his father's face. Cade, for his part, worked to repair the parts of the house that had fallen into disrepair, patching the broken window in the study, reinforcing the porch steps that had groaned so precariously beneath Mira's weight the night of the storm. He worked with the quiet, focused intensity of a man who needed physical labor to keep his mind from wandering into places he did not wish to visit, and Mira recognized that particular kind of avoidance because she practiced her own version of it daily, filling her hours with tasks for Ellis so she would not have to sit with her own grief for too long. They did not speak much in those first days, beyond what was necessary. Cade would tell her when he planned to walk to the small trading post 2 towns over, the only place he dared show his face, to gather supplies. Mira would tell him what Ellis needed, more cloth diapers, a particular kind of formula that seemed to settle his stomach better than what Cade had been using, a soft toy that might help soothe him during his fussier hours. Their conversations remained practical, careful, both of them navigating the strange new arrangement with the caution of 2 people who had been burned badly enough by trust that neither wished to extend it too quickly again. But small things began to shift, almost without either of them noticing at first. Mira found herself humming softly, while she rocked Ellis to sleep in the evenings, old lullabies her aunt had sung to her when she was very small, before the warmth had drained entirely from their relationship. She noticed, one evening, that Cade had paused in the hallway outside the nursery, listening, though he quickly moved on when she glanced toward the door, as though embarrassed to have been caught. Cade, in turn, began leaving small things for her without comment, a soft blanket he had found in a trunk upstairs, clearly meant for an adult rather than an infant, left folded on her bed one evening without explanation. A book, worn but intact, that he mentioned once he thought she might enjoy, given how few ways there were to pass the quiet evening hours in a house with no electricity beyond a small generator he ran sparingly. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Mira sat in the kitchen, mending a small tear in one of Ellis's blankets, while Cade worked at the table across from her, sorting through a small collection of tools he had brought back from his most recent trip to the trading post. The silence between them had grown comfortable, in a way neither had quite expected, filled not with tension, but with the easy quiet of 2 people who had grown accustomed to each other's presence. "Can I ask you something?" Mira said, not looking up from her sewing. Cade glanced up, something wary flickering briefly in his expression before he nodded. "Go ahead." "Ellis's mother," Mira said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate gentleness. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I've wondered." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the tools in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness Mira had not heard from him before, a vulnerability that suggested this was not a subject he had discussed with anyone since whatever tragedy had befallen him. "Her name was Leora," he said quietly. "We were mated for 3 years. When she became pregnant with Ellis, we were happier than I'd ever imagined possible." He paused, his jaw tightening. "There were complications during the birth. The healers did everything they could. It wasn't enough." Mira set down her sewing, her chest aching with a sympathy she did not know how to voice adequately. "I'm so sorry, Cade. I couldn't stay in our old house," he continued, as though the words, once started, needed to finish their course before he could stop them. "Everyone looking at me with pity. Everyone asking how I was managing, when the truth was I wasn't managing at all. I found this place, and I told everyone I was going away for a while, to grieve privately. That was almost a year ago. I never went back. And no one has come looking for you? For Ellis? Cade shook his head slowly. My family respects privacy, more than most. They send letters occasionally, which I don't always answer. I think they've decided to let me find my own way through this, however long it takes. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. I know it's not sustainable, raising him out here alone, cut off from everything and everyone. I've known that for months. I just haven't been able to make myself do anything different. Mira considered his words carefully before responding, understanding, in a way that surprised her, how deeply she recognized the particular kind of paralysis he described. She had spent the past 2 weeks avoiding her own grief in much the same way, filling her days with Ellis's needs so she would not have to sit alone with the wreckage of the life she had believed she was building with Callum. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, she said softly. You're allowed to take as long as you need. Cade's eyes softened, something in his guarded expression easing slightly. What about you? He asked. You never talk about him. The father. Mira's hands stilled on the blanket in her lap. There's not much to say, she said eventually. I loved him. I thought he loved me too. His family never accepted me, and in the end, that mattered more to him than anything we'd built together. Do you regret it, loving him? Mira thought about the question seriously before answering, turning it over in her mind. No, she said finally. I don't regret loving him. I regret not seeing sooner that it wasn't enough to build a future on. I regret trusting that his feelings for me would be stronger than his family's opinion of me. She looked down at her stomach, one hand moving instinctively to rest against the curve of it. But I don't regret this. Whatever happens next, I'll never regret this. Cade watched her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes. You're stronger than you probably realize, he said quietly. Mira felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment, and she busied herself with her sewing again to hide her reaction. I don't feel very strong most days, she admitted. Mostly I feel like I'm just trying to survive one day at a time. That's what strength actually looks like, Cade said. Not the absence of fear, just refusing to let it stop you. The conversation drifted into more comfortable territory after that, discussing plans for Ellis's growing needs, the repairs still remaining on the house, small practical matters that required no vulnerability to voice aloud. But something had shifted between them in that exchange, some barrier lowered that neither seemed inclined to raise again to its previous height. Over the following weeks, their partnership deepened in ways neither had explicitly planned. Mira took over most of Ellis's daily care, developing a bond with the small boy that surprised her with its intensity, given how briefly she had known him. She found herself singing to him during long afternoons, teaching him small sounds and gestures, watching with quiet delight as he began to recognize her voice, to reach for her with small, grasping hands whenever she entered the room. Cade, meanwhile, began including her more fully in the practical matters of running the household, teaching her which plants in the surrounding forest were safe to gather for food, showing her how to tend the small garden he had started behind the house, sharing stories, gradually, of his life before Leora's death, of the family he had once been close to, before grief had driven him into isolation. Mira's pregnancy progressed steadily through these weeks, her body changing in ways that made certain tasks more difficult, though Cade never once made her feel burdensome for needing assistance. If anything, he seemed to take a quiet pride in ensuring she had everything she needed, carrying heavier loads without being asked, adjusting the household routines to accommodate her increasing fatigue as the weeks wore on. One afternoon, as Mira sat on the newly repaired porch steps watching Ellis play with a set of wooden blocks Cade had carved for him, she found herself struck by an unexpected realization. For the first time since Callum's family had cast her out into the storm, she felt something that resembled peace. Not happiness, not exactly, not yet, with grief still raw beneath the surface of her days, but peace, and something that might, with enough time, grow into genuine contentment. She had come to this house seeking nothing more than shelter from a storm. She had not expected to find purpose, connection, or the beginnings of something that felt, cautiously, like belonging. But sitting there in the afternoon sunlight, watching a child who was not her own, laugh with delight at a tower of wooden blocks, feeling her own child shift and move within her, She allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to hope that perhaps this strange, unplanned refuge might become something more permanent than either she or Cade had initially intended. Weeks turned into months, and the house in the woods, once cold and abandoned, slowly transformed into something that resembled a home. Cade repaired the last of the broken windows, patched the roof where it had begun to leak, and built a proper crib for Ellis, replacing the makeshift arrangement that had served him through the difficult early months. Mira watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, feeling, with each small improvement, that the walls around them were becoming less a hiding place and more a genuine shelter, built with intention and care. Her pregnancy had entered its final stretch, her body heavy and slow in ways that made even simple tasks feel like small triumphs. Cade had taken to watching her more closely as the weeks passed, appearing at her side whenever she attempted anything strenuous, his concern evident even when he tried to disguise it as simple practicality. "You should rest," he told her one afternoon, finding her attempting to carry a basket of laundry down from the upstairs room she had claimed as her own. "I can manage that." "I'm pregnant, not incapable," Mira said, though she allowed him to take the basket from her hands regardless, too tired to argue the point with any real conviction. "I know you're not incapable," Cade said, his voice softer than his words might have suggested. "I just don't want you overexerting yourself, not when you're this close." Mira studied his face for a moment, noting the genuine worry etched into his features, and felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite her exhaustion. In the months since her arrival, she had watched Cade transform from a guarded, grief-stricken stranger into someone who anticipated her needs before she voiced them, who made space in his careful, ordered world for both her and the child she carried, as though it had always been the most natural thing to do. She had not expected, when she stumbled into this house fleeing a storm and a family that had discarded her, to find herself falling for the man who had taken her in. But somewhere in the quiet evenings spent talking on the porch after Ellis had fallen asleep, in the shared laughter over the small boy's increasingly ambitious attempts at walking, in the countless small kindnesses Cade had extended without ever asking for anything in return, something had shifted in her heart that she could no longer deny or ignore. She did not know if he felt the same. Cade remained careful in certain ways, maintaining a respectful distance that she suspected stemmed from his own grief, from a loyalty to Leora's memory that he was not yet ready to set aside, or perhaps simply from uncertainty about how she might receive any deeper expression of feeling. Mira understood that hesitation, recognized it as a mirror of her own caution, still healing from Callum's betrayal, still uncertain whether she trusted her own judgment enough to risk her heart again so soon. But there were moments, small and fleeting, that suggested the feeling might not be entirely one-sided. The way Cade's eyes lingered on her when he thought she was not looking. The careful, deliberate space he left beside her on the porch steps each evening, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The evening, several weeks earlier, when Ellis had fallen asleep between them, and Cade had reached over to gently brush a strand of hair from Mira's face, his fingers lingering against her cheek for a moment longer than the simple gesture required, before he seemed to catch himself and pulled back, murmuring an apology that neither of them quite believed. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Mira found herself sitting on the porch steps beside Cade, Ellis playing contentedly in the grass nearby with a set of small wooden animals his father had carved for him. The air carried the particular sweetness of early summer, warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers that had begun to bloom along the edge of the forest. "Can I tell you something?" Cade asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Of course," Mira said, turning slightly to face him. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on Ellis as the boy carefully arranged his wooden animals in a careful row, muttering happily to himself in the particular nonsense language of very young children. "When Leora died," he said finally, "I told myself I would never feel this way again. Not about anyone. It felt like a betrayal of her memory, even to consider it." Mira's heart began to beat faster, though she remained still, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "But these past months," he continued, "watching you with Ellis, watching the way you've made this house feel like a home again, watching you carry your own child with such fierce determination, despite everything you've been through." He paused, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture she had come to recognize as nervousness. I don't think Leora would want me to spend the rest of my life alone, punishing myself for surviving when she didn't. And I think, somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as simply someone I was helping, and started seeing you as someone I—" He stopped himself, seeming to lose his nerve entirely. "Someone you what?" Mira asked softly, her own heart pounding in her chest. Cade turned to look at her fully then, his dark eyes carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him, even in their most honest conversations. "Someone I care about," he said finally. "More than I expected to. More than I think I'm supposed to, given everything that's happened." Mira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though these were not the tears of grief or fear she had grown so accustomed to over the past months. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to either, not after everything with Callum, but you've shown me, every single day, what it actually means to be valued, to be trusted, to be seen as more than just an inconvenience to be managed." She paused, gathering her courage. "I think I might be falling in love with you, Cade. I know that's probably too soon to say, given everything." "It's not too soon," Cade interrupted gently, reaching over to take her hand in his fingers warm and steady around hers. "Grief doesn't follow a timeline any more than love does. I learned that from you, actually, more than a little." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, hands intertwined, watching Ellis continue his careful arrangement of wooden animals in the fading evening light. Mira felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had found not just safety, but genuine happiness, a future she could actually look forward to, rather than simply endure. "I want you to know," Cade said eventually, his voice serious, "that whatever happens with your child, when they arrive, I want to be part of that. Not as some obligation, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I want to help raise them, if you'll let me. I want us to be a family, if that's something you want too." Mira's breath caught in her throat, the weight and sincerity of his words settling over her like the warmth of the summer evening around them. "I want that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want that more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." Cade smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his usually serious features into something warmer, softer, more at peace than she had seen him since her arrival at this house. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, the gesture simple, but carrying a weight of promise that neither of them needed to voice aloud. Their peace, however, would prove short-lived. The following morning, as Mira prepared breakfast in the kitchen while Cade tended to the garden outside, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the quiet stillness of the forest surrounding the house. Mira froze, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. In the months since her arrival, no vehicle had ever approached this isolated property. Cade had been careful, deliberate about maintaining the house's abandoned appearance from the road, precisely to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. She moved quickly to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains toward the overgrown driveway, and felt her blood run cold at what she saw. A sleek black car had pulled to a stop at the edge of the property, and emerging from it, unmistakable even after months apart, was a face Mira had hoped never to see again. Callum's father stood beside the car, scanning the house with sharp, calculating eyes, and beside him, expression cold and determined, stood Callum's mother, the woman whose cruel words had driven Mira out into that fateful storm months earlier. They had found her. Mira's hands trembled as she stepped back from the window, her heart hammering so violently against her ribs that she felt certain it could be heard outside. How had they found her? She had been so careful, had trusted so completely in the isolation of this hidden house, that the sight of that black car now sitting at the edge of the driveway felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed safe. "Cade," she called, her voice tight with panic, moving quickly toward the back door where he had been tending the garden only moments before. "Cade, someone's here." He appeared almost immediately, alerted by the fear evident in her voice, his eyes sweeping the situation with the same sharp assessment she imagined he had once used in whatever life he had lived before retreating into this isolated existence. "Who?" he asked, already moving toward the front of the house. "Callum's parents," Mira said, following close behind him, one hand pressed protectively against her rounded stomach. "I don't know how they found this place. I don't know what they want." Cade's jaw tightened, and Mira watched something shift in his posture. a protective instinct rising to the surface that reminded her, briefly and painfully, of Callum's own family, standing over her in judgment months earlier. But where their posture had radiated cruelty, Cade's radiated something entirely different, a fierce, unwavering determination to shield her from whatever threat now stood at his door. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." They reached the front door, just as a sharp knock echoed through the house, deliberate and impatient. Cade glanced back at Mira once, a silent question in his eyes, and she nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. Whatever Callum's parents wanted, she needed to face it. Hiding would only delay the inevitable, and she had spent enough months hiding already. Cade opened the door, positioning himself deliberately in the frame, his broad shoulders blocking much of the entrance. Callum's father stood on the porch steps, his expression carefully neutral in the practiced way of someone accustomed to negotiations and careful diplomacy. Behind him, Callum's mother's eyes swept past Cade immediately, searching, and found Mira, standing just behind him in the hallway. "There you are," the older woman said, her voice carrying a false warmth that did nothing to disguise the calculation beneath it. "We've been searching for months." "Why?" Mira asked, stepping forward despite Cade's earlier instruction, unwilling to let this woman speak over her in her own home, however temporary that home might prove to be. "You made it very clear I wasn't wanted." Callum's father cleared his throat, exchanging a brief glance with his wife before speaking. "Circumstances have changed," he said carefully. "Callum has had time to reflect on his actions. He recognizes now that he acted rashly, without fully considering the consequences." "And what consequences would those be?" Cade asked, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Mira had never heard from him before. "The child she's carrying? The one you all decided wasn't worth acknowledging?" Callum's mother's expression flickered, irritation briefly breaking through her careful composure, before she smoothed it away again. "The child is Callum's heir," she said, addressing Mira directly, ignoring Cade entirely, as though he were simply an obstacle to be worked around, rather than a person deserving of response. "Our family's bloodline. We've come to bring you both home, where you belong." "I have a home," Mira said, her voice steadier than she felt, though the anger building in her chest lent her words a strength she had not anticipated. "You made sure of that yourselves, when you threw me out into a storm, pregnant and alone, without a single thought for what might happen to me or this child." "That was a mistake," Callum's father said, though his tone carried none of the genuine remorse the words should have implied. "We're prepared to correct it. Callum is prepared to accept the child as his own, to give you both the life and status you deserve." "The life and status I deserve," Mira repeated slowly, "is not something that depends on your approval or your bloodline. I found that already, without any help from your family." She glanced briefly at Cade, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her, before turning back to face Callum's parents fully. "This child will be raised knowing they are loved unconditionally, not treated as a bargaining piece for your family's legacy." Callum's mother's composure finally cracked entirely, her eyes narrowing with the same cold contempt Mira remembered from that terrible night months earlier. "You have no right to deny this child their birthright," she snapped. "Whatever fantasy you've built out here with this stranger, it doesn't change the fact that the baby you're carrying belongs to our family, by blood if nothing else." "The child belongs to no one but themselves," Cade said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to genuinely surprise Callum's parents, both of whom turned to look at him properly, for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "And Mira is not alone in this. If you've come here believing you can simply claim what you abandoned months ago, you'll find that decision considerably more difficult than you anticipated." "And who exactly are you?" Callum's father asked, his tone carrying a note of dismissive challenge. "To interfere in a matter that concerns our family?" "Someone who has spent the past several months caring for Mira and her child, when your family chose cruelty instead," Cade said. "Someone who intends to continue doing so, for as long as they'll have me." The declaration hung in the air, and Mira felt her heart swell with a fierce gratitude that momentarily overshadowed even her fear of this unexpected confrontation. She reached for Cade's hand, and he took it immediately, his fingers closing around hers with a steady, reassuring pressure. Callum's mother's eyes moved between them, understanding dawning slowly across her features, followed quickly by renewed anger. This is exactly the kind of behavior I would expect, she said scornfully. Running off with the first alpha, willing to take you in. Callum was right to question your intentions, from the very beginning. Callum was wrong about everything that matters, Mira said, her voice steady, despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. He was wrong to let his family's opinions matter more than the life we were supposed to be building together. He was wrong to abandon me and our child, without even the courage to face me himself. And you are wrong now, believing that showing up months later with empty promises entitles you to anything from either of us. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke, the confrontation hanging suspended in the space between the open door and the porch beyond. Then Callum's father shifted, his expression hardening into something more calculating, more dangerous. We won't simply walk away from this, he said quietly. This child carries our family's blood, regardless of what arrangement you've built out here in the woods. We have resources, connections, and the means to pursue this matter through whatever channels prove necessary. I would suggest you consider carefully whether this, he gestured vaguely toward Cade and the house behind them, is truly the life you wish to fight for. I've already fought for it, Mira said. Every single day since your family cast me out. I'm not afraid of continuing that fight, if that's what it takes to protect my child from a family that only wants them as a possession, rather than a person to love. Callum's mother opened her mouth to respond, but her husband placed a hand on her arm, silencing whatever cutting remark she had prepared. This isn't finished, he said instead, addressing Mira directly. You'll be hearing from our legal counsel. With that, they turned and made their way back down the porch steps, toward their waiting car, Callum's mother casting one final, venomous glance over her shoulder, before climbing inside. Mira and Cade remained in the doorway, watching the black car navigate the overgrown driveway before disappearing back onto the main road, the sound of its engine fading gradually into the quiet stillness of the forest. Only once the sound had faded entirely did Mira allow herself to release the breath she had been holding, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. Cade caught her immediately, one arm wrapping securely around her waist, guiding her toward the nearest chair. "Are you all right?" he asked, kneeling beside her, his earlier fierce composure giving way to open concern. "I don't know," Mira admitted, her hands trembling in her lap. "They know where I am now. They know about the baby. What if they actually pursue this legally? What if they try to take my child from me?" Cade took both her hands in his expression fierce, with a protectiveness that steadied her far more than any words could have. "They won't succeed," he said firmly. "I promise you, Mira. Whatever it takes, whatever resources I need to find, I will not let them take this child from you. We'll face this together, however difficult it becomes." Mira looked into his eyes, searching for any hesitation, any doubt behind his promise, and found none. Only unwavering determination, and the same fierce love that had grown quietly between them over the past months, now called suddenly and unexpectedly into a battle neither of them had anticipated having to fight. "Together," she repeated softly, drawing strength from the word itself, from the reality of not facing this threat alone, the way she had faced so much else in recent months. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." Ellis, sensing the tension in the room, began to fuss softly from his place on the floor nearby, and Mira reached for him instinctively, pulling him into her lap alongside her own protective embrace of the child still growing within her. Cade watched them both, his expression a complicated mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness, and Mira understood, in that moment, exactly how much they now stood to lose, and exactly how hard they would both fight to ensure they never had to. In the days that followed the confrontation, a tense unease settled over the house, a stark contrast to the peaceful rhythm they had built together over the previous months. Cade left the property twice in quick succession, traveling to the nearest town to consult with a lawyer he had once known through his own family's connections, someone he trusted to advise them on how best to protect Mira's rights as the child's mother. Mira spent those anxious hours caring for Ellis, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, despite the fear that gnawed constantly at the edges of her thoughts. She had grown so accustomed to feeling safe within these walls that the sudden reappearance of Callum's family felt like a violation of the sanctuary she had worked so hard to build. "The lawyer says we have a strong position," Cade told her one evening, settling onto the porch steps beside her after Ellis had finally drifted off to sleep. "Legally, and Omega cannot be forced to surrender custody of their child simply because the father's family objects to the circumstances. Callum would need to formally acknowledge paternity and pursue custody through proper legal channels, which would require him to appear in person, to make his case directly, rather than relying on his parents to handle everything for him. "Do you think he will?" Mira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Cade considered the question carefully before responding. "From what you've told me about him, I think it's more likely his parents will continue trying to intimidate you into compliance, rather than actually pursuing a lengthy legal battle. Court proceedings would require public acknowledgement of exactly what happened, and I doubt his family wants that kind of scrutiny." Mira nodded slowly, though the reassurance did little to ease the tight knot of anxiety that had settled permanently in her chest since that morning. What if they try something else? What if they don't go through legal channels at all? Cade's expression grew serious, and he reached over to take her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. "Then we'll be ready for that too," he said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you or this child, Mira. I promise you that." Despite his reassurances, the following weeks brought a steady stream of unsettling developments. Letters arrived at the small trading post where Cade collected mail and supplies. Formal documents from a legal firm representing Callum's family, demanding meetings, threatening legal action, attempting through careful, calculated language to intimidate Mira into surrendering claims she had never actually made regarding the family's wealth or status, twisting her simple desire to raise her child in peace into something that sounded, in their careful phrasing, almost predatory. Mira read each letter with growing frustration, recognizing in the manipulative language the same cruel calculation that had characterized her entire relationship with Callum's family from the very beginning. They had never seen her as a person worthy of respect, only as an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved through whatever means proved most efficient. "They're trying to wear us down," Cade observed one evening, reading through the latest letter with a deepening frown, hoping we'll simply give in out of exhaustion or fear of a prolonged legal battle. "They don't know us very well then," Mira said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Months ago, she would have crumbled beneath this kind of pressure, would have doubted her own worth enough to believe she deserved whatever treatment Callum's family decided to impose upon her. But something had changed in her during her time at this house, some quiet strength cultivated through Cade's steady support, through the fierce love she felt for the children in her care, both Ellis and the child still growing within her. As her due date approached, drawing steadily closer with each passing week, the legal pressure from Callum's family seemed to intensify rather than fade, as though they sensed the approaching birth might represent their final opportunity to assert whatever claim they believed they held over the child. Cade grew increasingly protective during this period, rarely leaving Mira's side for more than a few hours at a time, ensuring the house remained secure, watching the driveway with a wariness that spoke to genuine fear of what Callum's family might attempt next. One evening, as a particularly severe storm rolled through the forest, echoing eerily the storm that had first brought Mira to this house months earlier, she found herself unable to sleep, her body restless with the particular discomfort of late pregnancy, her mind circling anxiously through every possible threat Callum's family might yet pose. She made her way downstairs, seeking the comfort of the kitchen's warm lamplight, and found Cade already there, seated at the table, a single candle burning low beside a stack of papers he had been reviewing. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, looking up as she entered. "No," Mira admitted, lowering herself carefully into the chair across from him. "Too much on my mind." Cade set down the papers he had been studying and reached across the table to take her hand. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not when the baby arrives. Not if Callum's family tries something worse than legal letters. You and this child, and Ellis too. You're my family now. I intend to protect that, whatever it takes." Mira felt tears prick at her eyes, though these carried none of the fear or grief that had characterized so many of her tears in recent months. These were tears of gratitude, of overwhelming love for the man sitting across from her, who had transformed her entire understanding of what family, what partnership, what genuine care could look like. "I love you," she said softly, the words feeling both entirely new and completely natural, as though she had been building toward this declaration for months, without quite realizing it. "I don't think I properly said that before," Not in those exact words. But I do. I love you, Cade. Cade's expression softened entirely, the careful guardedness he still occasionally carried, dissolving completely, as he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. I love you too, he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion she had rarely heard from him. I didn't expect to feel this way again, not after Leora. But you've shown me that love doesn't diminish what came before it. It simply grows to hold both. They remained there together for a long while, hands clasped across the small kitchen table, the storm raging outside the windows while inside, the warmth between them held steady against whatever uncertainty the coming days might bring. Whatever challenges Callum's family intended to pursue, whatever legal battles might yet lie ahead, Mira found herself facing them now not with the desperate fear of a woman alone, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found a partner, willing to stand beside her through anything. The storm eventually passed, as storms always did, leaving behind a stillness that settled over the house like a held breath. Mira returned to bed that night, with Cade's promise echoing in her mind, and for the first time since Callum's parents had appeared at their door weeks earlier, she slept soundly, trusting fully in the strength of the family she had built, however unconventional its beginning had been. But even as peace settled over the house that night, storm clouds of an entirely different kind were gathering elsewhere, as Callum's family prepared their next move, one considerably more direct than the legal letters and veiled threats they had employed thus far. The next attempt came without warning, nearly 3 weeks later, on an afternoon that had begun like any other. Mira, now heavily pregnant and moving slowly through her days, sat on the porch watching Ellis toddle unsteadily across the grass, chasing after a small wooden ball Cade had carved for him. Cade himself had walked to the edge of the property to check the small garden they had expanded together over the summer months, close enough to remain within sight but far enough that Mira found herself alone with Ellis for the first time in several days. She did not hear the car approach until it was already turning into the overgrown driveway, and by the time she registered the sound, a second vehicle had pulled in behind the first, both unfamiliar, both moving with a purposeful speed that immediately set her nerves on edge. "Cade," she called out, pushing herself up from the porch steps as quickly as her pregnant body allowed, scooping Ellis into her arms despite the strain it placed on her back. "Cade, someone's coming." He was already moving, she saw with relief, cutting across the garden at a run, his expression fierce with the same protective urgency she had witnessed during their previous confrontation with Callum's parents. But this time, as the cars came to a stop and their doors opened, it was not Callum's parents who emerged. It was Callum himself, along with 2 men Mira did not recognize, their bearing suggesting they had been brought along for purposes considerably more concerning than simple conversation. "Mira," Callum said, stepping forward, his eyes moving briefly to her rounded stomach before returning to her face. He looked different than she remembered, thinner, more haggard, as though the months since their separation had not treated him kindly either. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to discuss," Mira said, backing toward the porch steps. Ellis clutched protectively against her chest. "Your family has made their intentions clear enough through their lawyers." "This isn't about the lawyers," Callum said, taking another step forward, and Mira noticed, with growing alarm, that the 2 men who had accompanied him were spreading out slightly, positioning themselves in a manner that felt distinctly threatening, rather than simply supportive. "My parents are done waiting for legal proceedings to resolve this. They've decided to take a more direct approach." Cade reached Mira's side in that moment, positioning himself deliberately between her and the approaching men, his entire body tense with barely restrained fury. "You need to leave," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge Mira had never heard from him before. "Now." "This doesn't concern you," one of the unfamiliar men said, his voice cold and businesslike. "We're only here for the child." The words sent ice through Mira's veins, and she instinctively tightened her hold on Ellis, though she understood immediately, with a horror that nearly stole the breath from her lungs, that they were not referring to Cade's son at all. "You are not taking my child," Mira said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound firm. "Not now, not ever." "The child isn't born yet," Callum said, though something in his expression suggested even he found the situation distasteful, though not enough, apparently, to refuse to participate in it. "But once they are, my family has legal grounds to pursue custody, and we intend to ensure that process isn't complicated by you disappearing again into hiding. So what? Cade said, his voice low and dangerous. You intend to hold her here against her will until the baby arrives, and then simply take the child from her? Callum's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have, and Mira felt a fresh wave of horror wash over her at the realization of exactly how far his family was willing to go to claim what they believed belonged to them. You won't touch her, Cade said, stepping further forward, positioning his body as an immovable barrier between Mira and the men approaching. Whatever legal fantasy your family has constructed for themselves, I promise you, this will not go the way you're imagining. One of the unfamiliar men moved forward, and Cade met him without hesitation, the confrontation escalating with alarming speed. Mira backed further toward the house, Ellis crying now, sensing the tension and fear radiating from every adult around him, and she fumbled for the door handle behind her, desperate to get the children to safety, while Cade held the line against the approaching threat. Mira, wait, Callum called out, and something in his voice, some genuine note of hesitation beneath the coldness of his family's directive, made her pause, despite everything. What? She demanded, turning back to face him. Ellis still clutched protectively against her chest. Callum looked between her and the confrontation unfolding between Cade and the two men his parents had sent, and something shifted across his features, a war of conflicting loyalties playing out plainly on his face. This isn't what I wanted, he said quietly, almost too quiet for her to hear, over the sounds of the struggle happening nearby. I never wanted it to come to this. Then stop it, Mira said desperately. Call them off. This is your child too, Callum. Do you really want them to grow up knowing their father allowed this to happen? For a long, agonizing moment, Callum remained frozen, clearly torn between the family loyalty that had governed his entire life and the small flicker of conscience Mira's words had apparently awakened. Then, with a suddenness that surprised everyone present, he moved, stepping between the two men and Cade, raising his hands in a gesture of forceful intervention. Enough, he said sharply. Stand down, both of you. The two men hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to having their directives countermanded, but something in Callum's tone, some authority Mira had rarely witnessed from him during their entire relationship, made them pause. This wasn't the plan, one of them said warily. The plan is off, Callum said firmly. I'm not letting this happen this way. Get back in the car. Cade stood breathing heavily, his knuckles bruised, his expression still fierce with protective fury, watching warily as the two men exchanged uncertain glances before reluctantly retreating toward their vehicle. Callum remained where he stood, looking suddenly exhausted, the weight of whatever internal battle he had just fought settling visibly across his shoulders. I'm sorry, he said, turning back to Mira, his voice carrying a genuine remorse she had not expected to hear from him again. For all of it, for that night, for everything since. I let my parents convince me that reclaiming some sense of control over the situation would fix what I'd broken. I see now how wrong that was. Mira studied him carefully, uncertain whether to trust this sudden shift, though something in his exhausted, genuine expression suggested this apology carried more weight than any of his family's calculated legal maneuvers had managed to convey. What happens now? She asked warily. I'll tell my parents to stop, Callum said. I'll make it clear that pursuing this any further will only bring the kind of public scrutiny they've been desperate to avoid this entire time. I can't undo what I did to you, Mira, but I can stop making it worse. He looked toward Cade then, something complicated passing across his features. You're good to her, he said quietly. Better than I was. I can see that clearly enough now. He paused, glancing at Ellis, still held protectively in Mira's arms. Take care of them. All of them. Without waiting for a response, Callum turned and made his way back to the remaining car, the two men who had accompanied him watching with evident confusion as he climbed inside without another word. The vehicles pulled away moments later, disappearing back down the overgrown driveway, leaving Mira and Cade standing together in stunned, exhausted silence. Are you all right? Cade asked, immediately moving to her side, one hand gently checking Ellis, while the other wrapped protectively around Mira's shoulders. I think so, Mira said, though her entire body trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. I can't believe he actually stopped them. Neither can I, Cade admitted, guiding her carefully toward the porch steps, easing her down onto the wood, despite her protests that she was fine, that she didn't need to sit. but I don't trust this is truly over. His parents won't simply accept his decision without a fight of their own. Maybe not, Mira said, leaning into his steady presence, drawing strength from his nearness, even as her body continued to shake with the residual fear of the confrontation. But for now, we're safe. That's enough for tonight. Cade pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead, his arms wrapping securely around both her and Ellis, and for a long moment they simply remained there together, absorbing the reality of the danger they had just narrowly survived, grateful beyond words for whatever flicker of conscience had ultimately saved them from a confrontation that could have ended far more catastrophically than it had. That evening, as Mira finally settled into an exhausted sleep, her body aching from the stress of the day's events, she felt a sharp, unmistakable pain radiate through her lower back, different from anything she had experienced during the entirety of her pregnancy. She sat up slowly, breathing carefully through the sensation, and felt a warm rush of fluid between her legs that confirmed, with startling clarity, exactly what was happening. Her baby was coming. "Cade," Mira called out, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and disbelief, as another contraction rippled through her body, sharper this time, unmistakable in its intensity. "Cade, wake up. It's time." He was awake, and beside her within seconds, his own exhaustion from the day's events forgotten entirely in the face of this new, more immediate reality. "Are you sure?" he asked, though the evidence was clear enough that the question felt almost rhetorical, asked more out of the particular disorientation that came with sudden significant change than genuine doubt. "I'm sure," Mira said, gritting her teeth against another wave of pain. "The baby's coming, Cade, now." Panic flickered briefly across his features before he visibly forced it down, replacing it with the same steady determination that had carried them through every challenge of the past months. "All right," he said, already moving, gathering the supplies they had prepared weeks earlier, in anticipation of exactly this moment, though the reality of it arriving now, in the middle of the night, following such an exhausting and frightening day, felt considerably more overwhelming than either of them had anticipated. "I'm here. We're going to get through this together." The house nearest with proper medical care remained too far to reach safely, not with contractions already coming with alarming frequency, and both Mira and Cade understood, without needing to voice it aloud, that this baby would be born here, in this house that had become their home, without the assistance of trained healers or hospital equipment. "I've read everything I could find about this," Cade said, helping her settle onto the bed they had prepared with clean linens weeks earlier, his voice carrying a forced calm that Mira recognized as entirely for her benefit, given how tightly his jaw remained clenched with obvious worry. "I know what to do. I promise. Mira, we're going to get through this." The hours that followed blurred together in Mira's memory, into a haze of pain and effort, punctuated by Cade's steady presence beside her, his voice a constant, grounding anchor through every difficult moment. He held her hand through each contraction, wiped the sweat from her brow, murmured encouragement in a low, steady voice that never once wavered, despite the evident fear in his eyes. Ellis slept undisturbed in his crib in the next room, blessedly unaware of the momentous event unfolding just beyond his door, and somewhere in the depths of her pain, Mira found herself grateful for that small mercy, that at least the small boy would not carry the memory of this difficult night. "You're doing so well," Cade told her, his voice thick with emotion, as the final, most intense stage of labor began, her body working with an instinctive determination that felt both entirely foreign and deeply primally familiar all at once. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." The final push came with a suddenness that stole Mira's breath entirely, followed immediately by a sound that broke through the exhausted haze of her pain and effort with startling clarity, the thin, indignant cry of a newborn infant, furious at the sudden shock of the world beyond the safety of the womb. "It's a girl," Cade said, his voice breaking with emotion as he carefully lifted the small, squirming infant, wrapping her gently in the soft blanket they had prepared weeks earlier. "Mira, you have a daughter." Mira reached for her immediately, exhaustion forgotten entirely in the overwhelming rush of love that flooded through her as Cade placed the small, crying infant against her chest. The baby's cries softened almost immediately at the contact, her small face scrunched and red, her tiny fists waving with the particular fierce indignation of the newly born. "Hello," Mira whispered, tears streaming freely down her face as she gazed down at her daughter for the first time. "Hello, little one. You're finally here." Cade knelt beside the bed, one hand resting gently on the baby's small back, the other cradling Mira's face, tears evident in his own eyes despite his obvious attempt to maintain composure. "She's perfect," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect." "Thank you," Mira said, looking up at him through her own tears. "For everything. For tonight. For these past months. For all of it. I couldn't have done this without you." "You did all the hard work," Cade said, a watery smile breaking through his earlier tension. "I just tried to keep up." They remained there together for a long while. The small family gathered in the quiet aftermath of the birth, Mira cradling her newborn daughter, while Cade knelt beside them both, occasionally glancing toward the door, where Ellis, woken perhaps by the commotion, had appeared, rubbing his eyes sleepily, clearly curious about the new sounds filling the house. "Come here," Cade said softly, lifting his son into his arms and carrying him closer to the bed. "Ellis, meet your new sister." The small boy stared at the newborn with wide, curious eyes, reaching out one tentative hand to touch her small fist, and something in that simple gesture, the innocent curiosity of a toddler meeting his new sibling for the first time, brought fresh tears to Mira's eyes. "What will we name her?" Cade asked, settling Ellis on the bed beside Mira, close enough that the boy could continue his fascinated observation of the newest addition to their family. Mira considered the question carefully, looking down at her daughter's small, peaceful face. "Nadia," she said finally. "It means hope. After everything we've been through to reach this moment, it feels right." "Nadia," Cade repeated softly, testing the name against the quiet of the room. "It's perfect." In the weeks that followed Nadia's birth, the house settled into a new rhythm, one filled with the particular chaos and joy of a growing family. Callum's family, true to Callum's word, made no further attempts at legal action or intimidation, and eventually, months later, a brief letter arrived acknowledging that they had decided to respect Mira's decision, wishing her well, without any further demands or veiled threats. Whether genuine remorse or simple practical calculation had motivated this final capitulation, Mira found she no longer cared enough to speculate. What mattered was that the threat had finally, truly passed, leaving her free to build the life she had chosen, without fear of further interference. Cade formally proposed to her on a warm evening in early autumn, nearly a year after that fateful storm had first brought her stumbling onto his porch, seeking nothing more than shelter from the rain. They were married in a small, quiet ceremony, attended only by a handful of trusted friends Cade had slowly reconnected with over the preceding months, Ellis serving as an enthusiastic, if somewhat chaotic, ring-bearer, while Nadia slept peacefully through the entire event in her mother's arms. The house itself continued its slow transformation, no longer bearing any resemblance to the abandoned, decaying structure Mira had first sought shelter within. Cade repainted the exterior, repaired the remaining damage to the roof and windows, and together they expanded the garden, planting flowers alongside the vegetables that had sustained them through their first months together. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch that had once creaked so precariously beneath her weight, watching Ellis and Nadia play together in the grass, while the sun set golden over the treetops, Mira often found herself reflecting on the strange, unexpected path that had led her to this life. She had arrived at this house with nothing, rejected and alone, fleeing a storm both literal and metaphorical, certain that her future held nothing but uncertainty and struggle. Instead, she had found a family built not from obligation or bloodline, but from genuine choice, from two broken people who had found in each other, and in the children they raised together, a strength and love neither had believed themselves capable of rebuilding after everything they had separately lost. "What are you thinking about?" Cade asked one evening, settling onto the porch steps beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched their children play together in the fading light. "Just how far we've come," Mira said, leaning into his warmth. "From that storm to this, I never could have imagined it." Cade pressed a gentle kiss against her temple, his expression soft with contentment. "Sometimes the worst nights lead us exactly where we're meant to be," he said quietly. "I'm grateful, every single day, that you found your way to my door." "I'm grateful you let me stay," Mira replied, smiling as Ellis let out a delighted shriek, chasing after his little sister, who had begun, in recent weeks, to take her first unsteady steps across the grass. The house that had once stood abandoned and forgotten deep within the forest now stood as a testament to something far more powerful than the neglect and loss it had once represented. It stood as proof that even in the darkest, most frightening moments, when everything familiar has been stripped away and the future feels impossibly uncertain, sometimes shelter arrives in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes the family we are meant to have is not the one we were born into, but the one we choose, deliberately and courageously, to build for ourselves. As the last light of evening faded into the soft darkness of night, Mira watched her family gather together on the porch, safe and whole and entirely her own, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a peace so complete it settled into every corner of her being. Whatever storms might yet come, she knew now, with unshakable certainty, that she would never again have to face them alone.